1983, I had a job where I earned lots of money, $13,000 a year. I decided I would go back to school so I could learn more, but also so that I can make more money. So in order to do that, I took an evening job where I went from earning $13,000 a year to $10,000 a year. I don't know if you know what a $10,000 a year paycheck looks like. It's about $300 every 2 weeks. And I was given 150 of those dollars to the school I attended, Loyola University of Chicago, and $125 every 2 weeks to my roommate. That's left me $25 every 2 weeks, $25 every 2 weeks for pretty much nothing. In my field of study, social work, I did an internship, a practicum. My first practicum was at a hospital. And the first time I showed up, I was asked to go home because I was wearing gym shoes. They said, this is a professional hospital. We don't wear gym shoes here. So where was I going to get a pair of dress shoes for $25? Some of you are thinking Goodwill, Salvation Army. Years ago, there was a shoe chain called Favor Shoes. It was discount shoe chain. And I walked into Favor Shoes. And the only shoes I could afford for $25 were plastic. And the problem was that in September, as you know, it rains a lot in September. So I quickly discovered that plastic and rain, they don't mix. And so I was slipping and sliding all over the place. And right around November, I had a larger concern. A hole formed right at the tip of the shoe. So now when I walk down the street, my shoes were talking. In December, I was scared because it snows a lot in my town in December. So my fear was that snow would get in the tip of my shoe and I would die of frostbite. So I took my shoe to the nearest shoe shop and set it on the counter. The owner looked at my shoe and he said, you may as well throw these away, son. These are plastic. We don't fix plastic. There's not worth to be said plastic can't be fixed. I walked out to that shoe shop and I walked about a mile and I found another shoe shop and I sat the shoe on the counter. The owner looked at my shoe and said, you may as well throw these away, son. These are plastic. We don't fix plastic. There's not worth to be said plastic can't be fixed. So now I'm desperate. I walk about 2 miles and I stumble into another shoe shop. I sat the shoe on the counter. The owner looked at my shoe for what felt like a lifetime. My heart was beating so fast I knew he was going to say, we don't fix plastic. Plastic can't be fixed. Said he said nothing, reached back, picked up a magnifying glass, looked at my shoe really carefully, then he looked up at me and smiled and said, I'll fix it. And that was 1983. This is the year 2020. He's been fixing my shoes for 37 years. Not the same pair, but he did fix those 4 times that year. What it said to me is it takes a special person to work at fixing something that the rest of the world says is not worth it, they can't be fixed. And that's the same thing a lot of people say about the clients you're working with substance use disorders. It's not worth it, they can't be fixed. So it really does take a special group of individuals to work with those who others shun in society. So before we begin, I salute you for the work that you do. Our topic's entitled Good Grief, helping clients with substance use disorders cope with loss. All right, so how many of you are familiar with the movie The Lion King? I imagine that most of you remember The Lion King, and the father in The Lion King, his name was Mufasa, and the son's name was Simba. If you remember, Simba was destined to be king. In fact, when he was a young lad, he would dance around on his toes singing a song called I Can't Wait to Be King. His father, Mufasa the king, had one piece of advice for his son. He said, son, whatever you do, stay away from there. And there was the forest. You remember when you were a kid growing up and your parents told you to stay away from there? And Simba couldn't wait to go there, the forest. And he wandered in the forest. He was surrounded by the hyenas. And that little bird yelled, Mufasa, the hyenas are about to eat Simba. Mufasa roared, and the hyenas ran away. And he scooped Simba up in his arms. He gave his son a hug. And that caught my attention because I hugged my father 3 times in my life. When I graduated from undergraduate, I hugged my father. The second time I hugged my father was when I graduated from graduate school. And the third time I hugged my father, he was in his casket. He had died smoking crack cocaine. Mufasa hugged his son. And Simba said, Dad, are you as courageous as the hyenas? He hugged him even closer. And Mufasa said, no, son, I'm not always courageous. In fact, I thought I would lose you today. He said, nothing frightens me more than the fear of being without you. I just muster up courage when I have to. Simba had an uncle whose name was Scar. I think lots of people are in addictions treatment because of relatives like Scar. They're the ones who abandon you, who abuse you, who neglect you. Scar was envy. He was jealous because he wanted to be king. And at one point during the movie, Mufasa was killed And Scar said to Simba, "It's your fault your father was killed. Get out of here." And Simba ran away. And he stumbled upon a bear cat and a warthog, Timon and Pumbaa, 2 gang members. And the first thing they did was they introduced Simba to a slimy substance to eat. And that wasn't what a king ate, so he coughed it up. Remember the first time you tried marijuana, you coughed? And then they taught him a song called Hakuna Matata, which pretty much means, don't worry about anything. So there was Simba, destined to be king, hanging out with Timon and Pumbaa, smoking marijuana, singing Hakuna Matata. It's kind of like a client on your caseload who had the capacity to be a doctor, a dentist, a judge, and hanging out with the wrong crowd. And then one day, Rafiki, the little monkey, we'll call Rafiki a certified addictions counselor from Atlanta, a social worker from Tennessee. Rafiki was swinging on a vine, and you spotted Simba hanging out with Timon and Pumbaa, about to smoke crack cocaine. You swung past and gave him a gentle tap. And Simba said, "Who are you?" And you said, "No, the question is, who are you?" You said, "I know who you are. You're Mufasa's son. You're the son of a king. And here you are hanging out with a pig and cat, smoking marijuana, singing Hakuna Matata." So you took Simba to a body of water, and you said, "Look in the water and tell me what you see." And at first, Simba saw his own reflection. But being the great therapist you are, you said, "No, look a little closer. What do you see?" And he saw his father's reflection. And the voice said, "Simba, you were meant to be more than what you have become. Go and take your place in the circle of life." And ultimately, Simba became king. To me, that is more than a cartoon. It is the story of a young fella that was on the path towards greatness. He suffered a loss. He was grieving. And rather than his uncle support him in his grief, he blamed him. Simba ran away, wound up hanging out with the wrong crowd, and then he met you. There was an intervention, and he was able to find his greatness. So we're going to address issues of loss suffered by clients with substance use disorders and identify strategies to help them maintain their recovery in the face of loss. We start with definitions of key terms. 2 definitions. One is grief. It reads that grief is a natural emotional reaction to a significant loss or expected loss. It is an essential component of the eventual process of recovery from loss. So I want to make a few points about that definition. Grief is automatic and natural. It is as natural as breathing. You suffer a loss, you grieve. Next point is that it's not a psychiatric diagnosis. Grief is not a psychiatric diagnosis. It's natural as breathing. You suffer a loss, it's automatic. And get this is the critical point. And we'll come back to this later. Most people who suffer a loss, they do not need therapy, they need support. The second definition is mourning, the outward expression of grief. Mourning too is very individualized. It can be manifest by crying, by sadness, by wearing certain clothes. Like I know in urban communities, when in my town, when a gang member is shot, others and killed, some will show up wearing t-shirts that say "Rest in Peace." Or some people will wear t-shirts with the face of the deceased on the t-shirt. I've been seeing lots of George Floyd t-shirts these days. Or police officers will wear police uniforms to funerals. Firefighters often wear firefighter uniforms to funerals. And then the military veterans often wear military uniforms to funerals. Talking about the deceased, celebrating, etc. Let's talk about the stages of grief. I'm going to share several models with you. The first model is by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And I imagine that many of you are aware of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. What I can tell you is that all therapy models are personal. Sigmund Freud developed psychoanalysis, and I've read in books that he had erotic sexual fantasies about his mother, even in midlife. Models that therapists develop are personal. In case of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she is the mother of grief work. She was born a triplet. And when she was a little girl, one of the triplets died, and she felt like a part of her died. So grief was always with her. She became a doctor and noted that doctors in hospitals, people can be dying all the time, but they rarely talk about it. So she came up with these 5 stages of grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross says when one suffers a loss, they go through a period of denial. Then they get angry. Then they start to bargain. And then depression sets in, and then acceptance. Now, because I'm a specialist in grief work, I went and read her memoir. And what I learned from her memoir is that whereas her model says that the final stage in grief is acceptance, actually grief doesn't begin until you accept the loss. In fact, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross said that these stages had nothing to do with death and dying. They don't fit death and dying. She called these stages what a person goes through when they receive news from their doctor that they have a chronic or terminal illness. So see if this makes more sense. Stage 1, denial. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross called that stage, this isn't happening to me. The doctor shows you your x-rays, you have cancer, and you say this doesn't happen to me, denial. The second stage, anger, why me, with an exclamation point. Now you're angry. The third stage, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross says that many patients who get news of a chronic illness start bargaining with God. God, if you let this tumor go away, I'll go to church 8 days out of 7-day week. You make things better, I'll be more faithful in terms of my religious practices. The next stage, depression, involves I'm dying of this condition. The belief that I'm dying of this condition, there's some sadness there. Then acceptance. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross called this stage, I'm ready for whatever comes my way. This is the difference between living with a condition and dying of a condition. There's a woman from Gambia, Africa, named Princess Zulu, who's HIV positive. She wrote a book a number of years ago called I Refuse to Die Before I'm Buried. She's been living with HIV maybe 25 years. She is a part of Congress in the Gambia. You know, the great sports anchor, Stuart Scott, had cancer. And Stuart Scott said, surviving cancer doesn't necessarily mean that you'll live. What surviving cancer means is that you lived the whole time that you were alive. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross said this had nothing to do with death and dying, because I'm convinced if this were about death and dying, there's another stage after acceptance. And I call that sixth stage of grief the messed up stage. You know, you suffer a loss and you're all messed up. About 26 years ago, I took a journey to a Commonwealth of the United States called the U.S. Virgin Islands. You ever been there? It's so beautiful in the Virgin Islands. I said to God, if I don't get to heaven, you could send me to the U.S. Virgin Islands, the palm trees, the oceans. And I was invited to the Virgin Islands to speak to a group of high school students that were cutting class, and they were smoking marijuana cigarettes about the size of trees. I mean, they were getting high. And following my speech, someone invited me on a cruise on the Atlantic Ocean. And the sun looked so multicolored, it was so beautiful, the palm trees. While I was on that cruise, I said, God, is heaven as beautiful as this? When I returned from the cruise back to the hotel room, the red light on my phone in the hotel room was blinking. So I called the lobby, and the person in the lobby says, call home, there's an emergency. Call your wife, there's an emergency. So I called my wife, and she told me our 6-year-old son, at that time our only child, had just died. And I went from what felt like heaven to hell. In fact, to be honest with you, I thought about staying on the island. I had been watching people drinking tequila the whole time I was there eating key lime pie. And I thought I'll never leave the island. I'll drink tequila, I'll eat key lime pie my whole life. And then I remembered that I was a drug counselor. And one of the things we told our clients is that when you're about to do something you'll regret later, play the tape forward. And I played the tape forward. And what I saw was that if I got drunk every night, the bottom line, I'd wake up every morning with a hangover, and I would still hear my wife's voice that our son had died. I didn't think I could ever do my work again. My heart was broken. I was devastated. And 4 things helped me that I'll share with you. That's really the backdrop of this presentation. So when I returned home, I called my godmother and I told her that my son died. And she told me that now I'm ready to answer the question that you've been asking me since you were 13 years old. She became my godmother when I was 13 years old. We never went through a religious ceremony. She just looked at me and said, he's my godson. And I've been asking her the same question since I was 13 years old. And this is the question. How come you never turn out the lights in your living room? I promise you right now, the lights in her living room are on. At midnight, the lights are on. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the lights in her living room are on. I said, don't you have an astronomically high light bill? How come you never turn your lights out in the living room? She shared with me that She had a son that died the year before she met me, and I looked like her son. So as soon as she saw me, she said, "You're my godson." She said, "Mark, you don't know this because the pain is so fresh, but you remain as close to your children in death as you were in life. Do you believe that your children are always your children?" She said, "The reason I never turn off the lights in the living room is so that if my son shows up to visit me spiritually, if he shows up in the middle of the night, it won't be dark, and I won't have to worry about him tripping over the living room furniture." And right away, I knew someone understood. And she and I had a phone conversation about our sons every week for a couple years. We were like a group therapy session of 2. That helped me tremendously. The second thing that helped was that at my son's funeral, there were lots of people there, but there were about 250 certified alcohol and drug abuse counselors at my son's funeral. Now, those of you who've done this work for a while, you know that the addictions field, we are a really hugging field. We hug each other. So at my son's funeral, I hugged 250 certified addictions counselors. Have you ever hugged 250 people? It nearly killed me, but it breathed life into me, and I did the unthinkable. You know, the philosopher said it's better to have loved and lost and never to have loved at all. Better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. So I received so much love at his funeral that me and my wife did the unthinkable. We had another child. He's 17 years old, my son. And he just graduated from high school, headed to college in the fall. But I had a problem at the funeral. I could not cry. Because all my life I was taught that men didn't cry. I was teased as a kid for crying. Big boys don't cry. There were people who didn't even know my son that was doing for me what I could not do for myself. A month later, it was time for me to renew my automobile insurance. I have an automobile insurance broker. I don't need a broker. I can go online and get Geico. But he was 70 when I was 30, a wise man. They say that every young man needs an older man in his life to affirm him. So Walter Blocker, my insurance agent, affirmed me, and I paid him. And I knew that he and I, too, were going to have a group therapy session or 2. You see, a few months before my son died, his daughter committed suicide, postpartum psychosis. She jumped to her death. And I walked in his office and I told him what happened with me. And I said, "It's too painful to keep her picture up. I noticed her picture's down." He said, "Oh, no." He said, "Oprah Winfrey has the picture." He said, "We just went on an Oprah Winfrey show about postpartum psychosis." He said, "Mark, as soon as Oprah returns the picture, it's going back up. And oh, by the way, Mark, by the way," he said, "men cry." He said, "Mark, men cry. I've cried every day since my daughter died." So I renewed my insurance. I took the policy, went to the car, put the policy in the glove compartment, and I started to cry. It was like 30 years of tears came out of me. First thing I did was I looked in the mirror because I wanted to see how I looked. I hadn't cried in so long, I was curious, how do I look? But it ceased to matter because I got my tears back. Did you know that women outlive men all over the world? And one of the reasons that women outlive men is because they have more permission to cry. I'm so convinced that tears are precious. If I could get away with it, if you could help me figure out how to get rid of the smell, I would keep an onion on me at all time and squeeze it about 10 times a day just so I can cry. That helped me with grief tremendously. And then finally, my wife and I went to so many grief workshops. We even went to like grief healing circles. And there was a woman who spoke at one of these events who was also a bereaved parent. And she said something that just was spectacular. She said that grief is not about forgetting, it's about remembering with less pain. The grief is not about forgetting, it's about remembering with less pain. And when you suffer a loss, you don't want to try to forget. For that which you try to forget has a way of haunting you. You want to hurt less. And the one way you can hurt less when you suffer a loss is to be able to tell your story as freely as you need to tell your story. And thus, through those experiences, I'm able to continue to do this work. So the first model I shared with you was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model. Remember that, 5 stages. Because I'm going to ask you about how you typically grieve when you suffer losses. The second model is by Joanne Josefowski. She says the first stage in grief is that you process the reality of the loss. while working to maintain our physiological needs, like food, water, and rest. You ever notice that sometimes when people suffer losses, they forget to eat and go to sleep, and then they wind up losing weight? The second stage, Joseph Foskey calls chaos. I have a theory about this second stage. You know how when you suffer a loss, you become more forgetful and confused? Here's what I think happens. I believe, if I can go backwards, I believe that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages are not really linear. I don't think they go in order: denial, anger, bargaining. I believe those stages are circular. I believe you can experience all of those emotions in the same hour. And when you have all of those emotions in your head, it's easy to be confused, i.e. like you're in a state of chaos. The third stage, Joseph Foskey calls adaptation. We learn to adopt a life without what we have lost. We seek connections through others, support systems, other grievers, work, school, church, and we develop new roles for ourselves. The fourth stage, she calls it equilibrium. We attain stability and balance in life, and we are able to consider self-potential without what we have lost. And then she says the fifth stage, and not everybody gets here. Some people wind up drinking so much they never get here. Smoking crack, they never get here when they suffer a loss. She calls this fifth stage post-traumatic growth. A metamorphosis occurs, and you emerge reshaped from the loss, developing more potential, greater altruism, spirituality, self-awareness, and appreciation of life. I'll give you a couple examples. There's a writer named Danielle Steele. Every book she writes becomes a New York Times bestseller. Some of her books have become movies. She didn't write her first novel until she was 50 years old. Think about that for a moment. Her husband died when she was 50 and she started writing. She took her life to greater heights after his death. Two of the Beatles, I forget which ones, but two of the Beatles had mothers die when they were really, really young, under age 10, and their fathers gave them guitars, and the rest is history. Eric Clapton had a son fall out the window and die. He took his work to greater heights. And then Madonna and Rosie O'Donnell met in a movie called A League of Their Own, about a professional women's baseball team during World War II. And Rosie O'Donnell said, boy, we got really close because Madonna was the only person I ever knew like me who had a mother die before she was 10. And Madonna told Rosie that one way she was able to be so free with her sexuality and her performances, her videos, is because her mother died when she was so young. Her mother never told her, stop doing that. So she was able to be free to be who she was. The third model is called the tier model. You accept the reality of the loss, and then you experience the pain of the loss, and then you eventually adjust to the new environment without what you've lost. You all have seen people who are divorced, but who continue to wear their wedding band for a while as if they're not divorced, or they don't change their ex-spouse's message on the answering machine. They may do that for a while they're adjusting. And then one day they take off their ring and they say, I'm ready to live life again. And they reinvent a new reality for themselves. And then the final model is by Becker, Hammond, and Russell. They say when you suffer a loss, you experience shock and numbness, an intense grief, yearning, you're wanting the person to come back in your life, or you're wanting that job back, or you're wanting that life before heroin back, intense grief. And then gradually you get reintegrated back into society. So let's chat. We have these four models. I'm going to go through them backwards. And I want you to put your response in chat. Which of these models of grief come closest to mirroring how you grieve when you suffer a loss? Is your style of grief like what Becker, Hammond, and Russell describes? Or is it more like the tier model? Or is your usual style of grief when you suffer a loss kind of more like what Joseph Foskey said? Or is your style of grief more like what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross identified? So Michelle, are you there? You're Ed. We invite you that they answer just to, I can't see the responses. If you let me know.
Yes.
Yes.
Joseph Foskey, tier model. Beckerham, most of them are, what's a combination?
Okay.
It's a combination.
Which brings me to a point. Grief is very individualized and unique, and no two people grieve exactly the same. You've been to funerals where somebody was crying, building an ocean in the corner crying, and someone else is not crying, but yet they both hurt, connected to the loss. We also want to talk for a moment about the kind of losses that your clients are experiencing right now as we speak. Your clients with substance use disorders, you can put that response in chat as well. What kind of losses are your clients experiencing?
Most are loss of freedom, jobs,
Yes.
residency, parents, childhood, partners, that stability, loss of children, and income.
Yeah, you know, they say right now that 40 million Americans are unemployed. We haven't had numbers like that, even if they were that high, doing since the 1930s. There's a lot of people out of work. And the research indicates that when there's high unemployment, when unemployment increases, you can expect more stimulant addiction, more opiate addiction, more suicide, etc. You know, based upon your response, last time I was with you on webinar, I suggested that every addictions professional needs to be a trauma specialist. And now I really think that every addictions professional needs to be a grief specialist as well. Let's talk about losses that individuals with substance use disorders experience. Number one is abandonment. I am convinced that at the core of addiction is childhood abandonment. And yet few people talk about it. I know I have abandonment issues. You know how I know? Because I still have an AOL email address. You know, both of my grandfathers were alcoholic. My great-grandfather was alcoholic. If you were standing close to me, you'd notice, I'm gonna lean forward. On the left side of my face, I have a little dot on my face. I'm gonna lean in so you can see this dot on my face. Right there. I've had that dot on my face since I was 2 years old. My mother told me that one day when I was 2 years old, I was left in the care of one of my grandfathers who went to the tavern, not a bar, a tavern, to get something to drink. And he left me on the kitchen floor, and there was a bottle of Drano on the kitchen floor. You all know Drano. And my mother said, I crawled over and I drank the Drano. I'm from one of those families that starts a story, but they rarely finish the story. You know those families, when kids are around, they get really quiet. So over the years, I've been left to fill in the blank. So here's my fantasy. I drank the Drano, and the Drano was bubbling in my system where Drano does, made its way to my face, was about to leave dots all over my face, but the doctors pumped my stomach and saved my life so I could speak with you today. I've got a good friend I went to high school and college with. About 6 years ago, my friend came and said, Mark, we need to join a health club together. In fact, we're getting older. We need to take care of our bodies. I said, are you kidding? My body's fine. Did you know when I was 2 years old, I swallowed Drano? And the only sign I swallowed the Drano was this little dot on my face. He asked me $1 million question. He said, the dot is the only sign you swallow the Drano. He said, how do you know your body's not green inside? Took 2 steps back and said, I don't know, but I do know that I've never been clogged up. There's the good news. I don't have any hair right here. This is not a fashion statement. There's no hair right here. One day when I was 7 years old, I was left in the care of one of my grandfathers again, and I tripped and I cut my head, and I was bleeding, and I went in his room to try to wake him up for about 20 minutes, but I couldn't because he was under anesthesia, meaning what? My grandfather was drunk. For after about 20 minutes of trying to wake him up, I went in the bathroom, I found the tape, the Band-Aids, and I doctored myself up, the gauze. I remember saying to myself at 7 years old, if I'm gonna depend upon anybody for the rest of my life, it's me I can depend upon. Do you know how many clients that we've had that had experiences like that in childhood, where they were abandoned by the adult caretakers, who came to believe that the only person they can depend upon is themselves, and later marijuana and alcohol and crack and heroin. Father hunger occurs. This is a loss that many clients grieve when the girl didn't get enough fathering. Incredible story about this boy who played Park District football. And he was a fifth string running back on the football team. What are the chances you'll ever get in the game as a fifth string running back? Slim to none. If you're a fifth string running back on a football team, you would have an easier time finding a penny in the Sahara Desert than ever getting in a football game. If you're a fifth-string running back on a football team, you'd be more likely to be struck by lightning 5 times in the same day and live. Your whole job as a fifth-string running back is to watch grass grow on the football field. The boy's father died. They held a funeral on a Friday. He walked in the locker room the following Saturday morning and said, "Coach, I want to play the whole game." And the coach did what you have done, let him play the whole game. He scored 5 touchdowns, ultimately, in that game. The coach said, "You're a fifth-string running back. How'd you score those 5 touchdowns?" The great Walter Payton from Mississippi never scored 5 touchdowns in a football game. The boy said, "Coach, when my dad was alive, he was legally blind. I figured since he died and went to heaven, that he could see me. I wanted him to be proud of me." In America, 50% of white youth, nearly 60% of Latino Hispanic youth, and 69% of African American youth are raised without their fathers in the home. For some kids, this is their first loss. The young men who I work with, who smoke weed every day, there's some tension connected to their relationship with their fathers that marijuana has a way of soothing. What about daughters and father hunger? There's a book that's called Whatever Happened to Daddy's Little Girl. And that book tells the story of what girls go through when they're deserted by their father. The author says that often girls go through what's called the search. She's 5 years old, and the phone rings. She's wondering, is that my father on the phone? There's a knock at the doorbell. Is that my father knocking? She's walking to school, and she's looking in the cars, men driving cars, and wondering, is that her father? My friends, some women are in their 50s and 60s and still searching for their fathers. The author says that women deserted by their fathers, when they're young as teenagers, they often go through a period of promiscuity. What the author says is that promiscuity is not about sex, it's about magical thinking. If I sleep with all of these people, maybe my father will discover how desirable I am and come back in my life. Girls deserted by their fathers, often as teenagers, date older partners, looking for dad. And for some of these girls dating older partners, that becomes her premature entry into adulthood. Introduction to sex, introduction to drug use, etc. Girls deserted by their fathers are 6 times more likely to be sexually abused than other girls. And you and I know there's a link between girls being deserted by their fathers and predators know that he's not there. Girls deserted by their fathers, according to the author, are 140 times more likely to have a baby as a teen. Her mindset is that my dad doesn't love me, but I will grow something inside of my body. I'll have a baby that will love me unconditionally and that will never be able to leave me. There's a link between girls being deserted by their fathers and heavy substance use, etc. And then what about mothers? What about mother hunger? There's so many kids who just really adore their mom. When I've done weekend retreats and I ask young men what kind of work they want to do, and young women, most of them want to work with issues around their father. But what about the mother? About 10% of young people that I work with have issues around their mom that may have had a role to play in their substance use, the grief for that relationship not being there. Matter of fact, there's a song that was sung by a man named B.B. King. I think it was the greatest blues song ever. 3 minutes of instrumental, 1 lyric, followed by 3 minutes of instrumental. I think if they had 2 lyrics, it might mess up the song. The song is called Mama Loves Me. And here's the lyric. Sometimes I think my mother's the only one who loves me, and she might be jiving too. What happens when you feel that your mother doesn't love you? I told my brother the other day that he and I, and the rest of our siblings, didn't get enough mothering because our mother didn't get enough fathering. I'll repeat it. That we didn't get enough mothering because our mother didn't get enough fathering. She was her father's favorite of 14 kids, but he was so intoxicated, so drunk, that he could not give her what she needed as a girl. So she became man hungry. She took care of the men in her life with no one taking care of the kids. But when you have that kind of pain, some people will medicate that pain, that grief early on with the use of alcohol and other drugs. We are talking about losses that individuals with substance use disorders grieve, loss of relationship with God, the more addiction progresses, disconnection from the elders and the ancestors. You're now hanging with a get high tribe. Loss of rites of passages. Usually tribes and the extended family help you figure out how you go from being a teenager to being a man or a woman. But sometimes when you leave the family's culture and you connect with a drug using culture, you don't have the opportunity to experience those positive rites of passage. Loss of innocence. You know, the girl was sexually abused when she was 12 and she no longer feels like a kid, which also can lead to a premature entry into adulthood. You see, with the divorce rate being as high as it is, when there's a divorce, often the boy becomes the man of the house. In fact, I talk to single parents all the time. I tell the mothers, single mothers who are usually raising the family when there's divorce, don't make him the man of the house. Let him stay a boy. Because think about it. You only have 12 years to be a boy, 6 years to be a teenager. You've got to be a grown man your whole life. I tell single mothers, if he's the man of the house, it means you're married to your mother. Now, you all don't know my mother, but you knew my mother, you'd understand the statement I'm about to make. If I was 12 years old, married to my mother, I'd smoke weed every day. I mean, that's a whole lot of pressure. Loss of childhood. There's a divorce. The mother takes on 2 jobs, and the oldest daughter is now the mother of the house, and so she's cheated out of her childhood. Loss of the stage of development. You know, this model here talks about the 4 stages of development. The consumer years, birth to age 18. And between birth to age 18, your goals, your task is to consume knowledge, to consume food, and that stage ends with a high school diploma. Tell your client that college is optional. There is something called the National College Dropout Hall of Fame. Zuckerberg is there, Bill Gates is there, Michael Jordan is there. There is no high school dropout Hall of Fame. The apprenticeship years, 19 to age 28. Think about it. From age 19 to 28, you can get anything from an associate's degree to a PhD. And then the productive years, age 29 to 70, you're actually working towards what you studied in the apprenticeship years, elder years, 71 and beyond. I want you to think about the fact that lots of clients we work with substance use disorders skip the consumer years because they may have a premature entry into adulthood, start getting high at an early age, etc. And they fall behind, and then they don't wind up graduating from high school. And during the apprenticeship years, when you were studying, now they're partying and getting high and having a good time and falling further and further behind. Think about it. There's some people who enter the addictions field as a professional at age 40 because they spent some years in recovery catching up. And then the elementary to high school years, deaths. You might be 8 years old and a grandparent dies and now you're grieving. You were closer to them than your own parents. Divorce is pretty hard on children, as are frequent relocations, transitions. Even going from like middle school to high school can be so difficult for some young people that they start getting high to cope with that transition. Expulsions, not making the cut. I have an online museum. And one of the things I keep up with that online museum are the number of athletes that were this close to becoming professional and they didn't make it. And they wind up spending the next 2 decades medicating that loss with the use of alcohol and other drugs. You see, they had a dream of buying their mother a house and they didn't make it. And so in grief, they start getting expulsions when you're in high school. Don't you think people who get kicked out of their regular high school and wind up going to an alternative high school is experiencing some grief? Part of bullying is isolating the person who's being bullied from other people. And being isolated, one may grieve and become depressed. Dropping out of school, and then breakups. You remember the first time you ever got your heart broken? All right, I got a question for you. Put your answer in chat. When you've had your heart broken, how long does it take to get over a broken heart? You can write your answer in chat. I'm curious how long you think it takes to get over a broken heart. And what do you see, Michelle?
Looks like, this is Ed, looks like it's going all the way from a couple of months to never.
Yeah. So somewhere from a couple of months, Ed, to never?
Yep.
You know, I used to counsel teenage girls with substance use disorders.
Somebody also pointed out, several folks pointed out, it takes until you get into another relationship to get over it.
Oh, and here's the problem though. We have lots of clients who have addictions, who have abandonment issues. So they choose partners who will abandon them, proving that they're unlovable. And then sometimes what they do is they jump in another one really, really quickly without doing the grief work necessary to move to the one before. And often what they wind up doing is dating that person's twin, someone just like the other person that they broke up with, because they never did the necessary work in order to move in a different direction. So the girls ask me, the teenage girls ask me, how come boys don't grieve when we break up with them, but we hurt so much when we break up, when they leave us? And I told her, I said, they do, they just don't let you see it. I used to lead a group with like teenage males who smoke weed every day. Just about every one of these young men had a story about a girl that broke their heart. It was at that point when she broke their heart that they started getting high every day. The adult years, loss of freedom. You know, we have many clients that wind up doing time in prison because of their drug use, loss of jobs, loss of self-respect, loss of dignity, loss of health, loss of relationships in adulthood connected to addiction, loss of relationship with your children, sometimes the death of your children, loss of your possessions. Your house was foreclosed on because you spent all the money on crack cocaine, loss of hope and loss of dreams. Incredible story about Muhammad Ali. When he was in the peak of his career as the great boxer, someone invited Muhammad Ali to a home where people living with Alzheimer's to cheer him up. So Muhammad Ali showed up with his entourage. He walked in a room with 20 people living with Alzheimer's. Muhammad Ali said, the champ is here. I'm the greatest of all time. Don't you recognize me? No one moved, no one flinched, no one blinked, no one recognized Muhammad Ali. He walked in the second room. There were 20 people in that room living with Alzheimer's. Ali said, the champ is here. I'm the greatest of all time. Don't you recognize me? They didn't move, they didn't blink, they didn't recognize Muhammad Ali. And Ali walked into a third room. There was an 85-year-old man sitting in a room by himself, staring out of the window. And Ali ran up to him and said, the champ is here. I'm the greatest of all time. Don't you recognize me? He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't recognize Muhammad Ali. And as Ali was leaving with his entourage, the 85-year-old man said, hey, champ, I recognize you. You are my boyhood hero. All my life, I wanted to meet you, champ. Finally, my boyhood dream has come true. You're the greatest of all time. Joe Louis. And Bundini Brown ran up to the 85-year-old man and said, oh man, that's not flat-footed Joe Louis. That's Muhammad Ali. Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. And Ali said, cool it, man, cool it. Didn't you hear what he said? He said his boyhood dream was to meet his hero. He said, never kill a person's dreams. Addictions kill dreams. And people grieve the loss of those dreams. And you are the individuals that really encourage them to live new dreams in recovery. How about the loss of the culture of addiction? William Wright wrote a book called The Culture of Addiction, The Culture of Recovery. And he talked about people who use socially prohibited drugs like crack cocaine, like heroin, like oxy. When they get shunned in society, they go and find what he calls tribes, using cultural language, people who are doing the same thing that they're doing. And if they're not careful, they can become as addicted to the tribe as they are the drug they're using. I had a nephew who smoked marijuana every day, who was gang affiliated. He can stop smoking marijuana, but he couldn't stay away from the gang. And when he went around the gang, he smoked. You have clients who have alcohol use disorder who can stop drinking, but they cannot stay away from the bar tribe, the bar culture. And when they go to the bar, they drink. When our clients are shifting from one culture to the next, they will grieve. What I've learned is that the goal is not to take away the drug culture. This is who they know. This is who supports them, but to introduce them to new cultures so they can gradually shift away, like 12-step culture, like recovery culture, like work culture, like school culture, loss of the drug itself. You ever think about the fact that we have lots of clients who grieve the loss of the drug? I sometimes ask teenagers, who's more predictable, drugs or people? Drugs, they tell me, are more predictable than people. So I've had some of my clients do this exercise called a goodbye letter to your drug of choice. The letter goes something like this: Dear marijuana, crack, heroin, thank you so very much for taking care of me. You got me through frequent relocations. Heroin, you got me through the death of my grandmother. You got me through my parents' divorce. You even got me through the time when an uncle abused me. Thank you so very much. As a matter of fact, if I could cocaine, I would give you a hug. And now I don't need you to take care of me. These are the things that I learned that I can do for myself in recovery. I know that you're cunning, baffling, and powerful. In fact, I know cocaine, you have the ability to fake your own death. You can act like it's not a problem, and I know that. I know you're gonna try to come back into my life. And these are the steps I'm gonna take to keep you out of my life, one day at a time. Loss of process addiction. You ever notice that some of our clients go from a chemical addiction to like sexual addiction or gambling addiction, and those addictions often lead them back to the chemicals, like a vicious cycle. And sometimes when they give those addictions up, they experience grief as well. And then the elder years, regrets. Erickson talked about a stage called generativity versus despair. When you look back on your life and you say, my life is a failure, why shouldn't I keep using? You know, I've helped many grandparents stop using after we talked about addiction running in their family across generations. Would you be willing to do this for your grandkids? Why grandkids? Why not kids? Because often grandparents and kids have a common enemy, that's why. But often they will do for their grandkids what they're unwilling to do for their kids, to make things better for the next generation. So let's talk about factors that complicate grief. I want you to know that there is something that's called complicated grief. You can tell when someone experiences complicated grief, they may not be able to sleep. I had an office manager who was 80 years old. When she was 9 years old, she had a thumping noise outside and it was raining. And they went outside and her mother, who was alcoholic, was coming home from a bar at 3 o'clock in the morning and was hit by, it was a drive-by hit and run. And my office manager is 80 years old and hadn't had a good night's sleep since she was 8 years old. Some people experience grief and they develop a mental illness. Others experience the grief and they develop a substance use disorder. Like the client who I had whose daughter at her birthday party swallowed a balloon. My friends try to keep balloons far away from small children. She died swallowing the balloon, and he smoked crack cocaine for about 20 years after her death. So factors that complicate grief. The person has a personal style of using avoidance as a major coping mechanism, or they may have adapted to a cultural norm which encourages us to grieve as quickly as possible and not remember what we've lost. Wars. You ever notice that we've been in Iraq and Afghanistan for over 20 years, and yet they never let us see the caskets, the bodies, and soldiers can grieve for a few days and get back on the battlefield? Or we've lost connection with the ancestors. The ancestors from every cultural group in the world had elaborate rituals for remembering what we lost. Or people have been disintegrated from their family. 200 years ago, when immigrants came to America via Ellis Island, they were living in tight dwellings, maybe 15 people in an apartment. But the best thing about that period is that if you suffered a loss, there will be lots of people there to support you. Technology, everything is so quicker these days. I was in Brooklyn and went to a drive-by funeral. You just drove by the pillar, put your name in, push the button, you can see the deceased from outside and just drive out that you were there. And the world of work. You see, that we don't work at the same organization, you and I, but I promise you, your policy and procedure manual at work says if you suffer a loss, you can grieve for 3 days, and your coworkers cannot grieve with you unless they're the fifth cousin on your mother's side of the family. Only 3 days is allotted to deal with grief in the world of work. The grieving person already has a psychiatric condition which makes them vulnerable to complicated grief like depression, PTSD, attachment disorder, psychotic disorder, borderline personality disorder, which is trauma and grief, and substance use disorders, which numbs the feelings of the pain of loss. Or unspeakable deaths, you know, like AIDS or suicide. Or how about this? Your client is gay in recovery in a small town. And in that town, there's a lot of homophobia. And that client of yours struggles to openly grieve the death of his partner, his spouse, because of fear of retribution in that town. So he doesn't speak on it. He keeps drinking. Unacknowledged losses. You see, my friends, when my son died, my first son, he was 6 years old. And let me tell you how the world took care of me. Not only did we get those 250 hugs at his funeral, but at his funeral, I received in the mail 250 cards of condolences. 50 plants showed up in the mail. I gave away 49 plants and I kept the cactus. I like the odds. And all of that support and all those condolences. And what I learned after the death of my son, there's a lot of women who've had miscarriages before and they never speak on it, or stillborns. So women would come up to me after my son's funeral and said, I had a miscarriage before. And I'd say, why are you whispering? Because miscarriages and stillborns and abortions, and when child welfare takes away your baby because of your addiction, those are unacknowledged losses. And unless people can talk about unacknowledged losses and grieve unacknowledged losses, this can be a major reason why they relapse. You know, every woman who I work with who've relapsed repeatedly, I always explore unacknowledged losses and think about it. The clients that we work with substance use disorders have more miscarriages, stillborns, babies taken away by child welfare so much more frequently than does the general population. Ambivalent losses. As we know, the great majority of our clients with substance use disorders have histories of trauma, and sometimes they have in their history an experience of being traumatized by someone who they love. That person dies or moves to another state. They're grieving their presence on earth or at home while being angry at the same time at the person. And of course, this complicates loss. Multiple losses: when it rains, it pours. Unsure your loved one is actually dead. Sudden death where you have no time to grieve, or you experience a whole lot of guilt because of the loss. Or first degree loss grief sequence: you witness someone die, you feel like you caused someone to die, and that complicates grief. Or you're so busy that you have no time to grieve. So let's talk about the characteristics of effective grief counselors. And I'll repeat what I said earlier. Every addictions professional should also be a grief counselor. The first characteristic is good listening and basic counseling skills. If you have no other skill other than the ability to listen, then you will help a lot of people with their losses. Just the ability to listen. Boundaries are important. I know a therapist whose wife left him, and so he was newly divorced. So he started doing groups with like single women that were recently divorced on Friday nights at 8 p.m. And he issued like massage as a part of the therapy. We talked to him, and you have to have some boundaries. People are sometimes vulnerable when they suffer losses. The ability to view grief as natural, slow to make grief pathological. Ability to discuss our own losses, not necessarily with clients, but just with ourselves and our friends and our loved ones. Because more we're able to talk about our own losses, the easier it gets. A number of years ago, my Aunt Annie died. And my sister asked me to pick her up and drive her to the funeral. That was about a decade ago. And my sister was doing something peculiar when I showed up to her house. She was cooking. I said, why are you cooking? We have a funeral to go to. She said, Mark, remember when we were young and there was a funeral, the old people would stay behind and cook? I said, I remember. She said, we're the old people now. And when you become the old people, you suffer a lot of losses. And the ability to talk about your losses makes it easier to talk with clients about theirs. Ability to talk about God. I remember, my friends, when my son died, I was angry with God. And I'm a religious person, and none of the cliches helped me, like God is a jealous God, God wanted him more, none of it helped. I was angry with God. And my relatives who are the most holy, you know, the ones who believe that it's a local call to God for them and long distance for everyone else. I said, don't be mad at God, don't be mad at God. I was mad because I'm almost my biographical sketch. I'm almost who they tell you I am when they introduce me to give a speech. I'm almost that guy. My son died. And I talked to a 67-year-old recovering person, non-degreed, an unlettered scholar, and he made it all make sense. And this is what he said. He said, Mark, you ever had a relationship with someone and you thought that you had a relationship with them? And then you had one falling out, you never heard from them again? I said, I have had those experiences. He said, a relationship is only real, get this, he said, A relationship is only real if it can survive some ups and some downs. And he said, this unlettered scholar said, if it's true for our relationship with people, then how come it can't be true with God? If God is big as we think God is, how come God can't handle our little anger? And once he shared that, I started to work through it. And I'm the man that gets the calls from clients who are angry with God. And I roll up my sleeve and I say, tell me all about it. Because I know as they talk about it, they're able to work through it like all other relationships. Ability to individualize their work and slow to prescribe pills for grief. Quick story about a client that we work with. We called her a cheerleader. And every night at like 3 o'clock in the morning, she would wake up and she would put on a cheerleading outfit and some pom-poms and she would start to cheer. And she would wake up the other 24 clients that were asleep. And she would also wake up the counselors who would sleep on the midnight shift. My friends, they always sleep. Don't believe they don't. The counselors would go in her room, wipe away their eyes, and she would start to cry. And then they would call the cheerleader psychiatrist and say, will you increase her medication? So one day I decided I would ask the cheerleader her story. And she was the valedictorian of her high school graduating class and the captain of the cheerleading team in high school. And she went from the Chicago Public Schools to UCLA on an academic and cheerleading scholarship. At age 19, she started hearing voices. Schizophrenia set in. At age 23, she's in our shelter crying. I realized what the cheerleader was doing was that she was grieving. She was grieving the life that she had before schizophrenia. And guess what? There's not a pill in the world that can treat grief. So let me let you in on a secret requiring your advocacy. The DSM-1, the DSM-2, the DSM-3, the DSM-4 had an exception for, like when you were assessing somebody for depression, the exception was grief. Because if you think about it, the symptoms of grief and the symptoms of depression mirror each other. So if you were a good clinician, they would ask you to, when you're diagnosing someone with depression, find out if they suffer recent losses. And if they have, then don't diagnose them with depression. In the DSM-5, they got rid of the grief exception. And now people are being assessed and diagnosed with depression who are grieving acutely. And guess what? Once you diagnose someone, you can recommend medication right away. Support before challenge. You know, when someone is suffering a loss and they struggle to move on with their life, before you challenge them, you have to support them first. You might remember a movie called Ordinary People starring Mary Tyler Moore. And the hero, the favorite son, drowned in a boat accident. He and his younger brother were in a boat accident, and the oldest son fell out of the boat and died, drowned. And the parents were looking at the younger son like, we wish it were you. Let me ask you a quick question. You know, parents always say, I love all my kids the same. Is that true? Some of you all in therapy right now because it's not true. So the youngest son went to therapy and the therapist kept hearing his story. He's stronger than me and he fell out and I wasn't strong enough, you know, to like pull him back in. And after several months of this dialogue, the therapist says, close your eyes and review the boat accident. And what he saw was that he was the one who was holding on and his brother was the one who let go. And the therapist said, I know you said he's stronger than you, but that day you were stronger than him. He eventually challenged them based upon the strength of their relationship. So what grief counselors do? They listen, they are emotionally present, they assist clients in expressing and identifying feelings, they normalize those feelings, they allow clients to show their feelings, and they listen non-judgmentally and with acceptance. So here's the question. You have a client who's grieving. And, you know, we're the only profession in the world that keeps a Kleenex in our office at all times. Your client is crying. At what point do you hand them the Kleenex? You can put your answer in chat. Client is crying because of a loss. When do you hand them the Kleenex? What do you see, Ed? What do you see, Michelle?
Let them get it out. Individualize when they ask for it,
Yes.
when they start crying.
Yeah, how many tears? A puddle? Just a little pond? You know, we process that. And here's a thought, a quick thought. Thank you, Michelle. Someone needs to mute themselves. If you hand them those clinics too soon, you may be inadvertently sending a signal to them that you're uncomfortable with their grief, uncomfortable with their tears. So I always like it when therapists leave them visible and the client is free to decide when to use them. Listen non-judgmentally and with acceptance is what grief counselors do. They let their genuine concern and care show. They encourage clients to talk about their losses. They provide data about the grieving process. They normalize that process. And they help clients tap into their natural resources for support. I am convinced that there are only 15 great therapists in the whole country, and all of them are on this call at this time. So what I'm often do is when clients suffer a loss, rather than refer them to therapy because they need support, we try to tap into their natural sources of support, their priest, their rabbi, monks, the medicine man, the whole tribe, the extended family, to support them in their grief. Pay attention to the impact of previous losses on current losses. Pay attention to events happening in the larger society and how these events affect clients. Lots of death we're seeing, COVID-19, racial conflict following the killing of George Floyd, et cetera. Ask our clients how these losses are impacting them. Many of our clients have loved ones who died of COVID-19. I met a man via Zoom in long-term recovery whose wife died of COVID-19. They've been married for 35 years. He couldn't go to the hospital to say goodbye. Grief counselors help with thoughts and thought patterns which may complicate grief, like self-blame. And then they help clients turn the pain of their loss into purpose, a cause. You know, I'm a logotherapist, and the great Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl developed a therapy called logotherapy. It comes from a Greek word, logos, which means purpose. A therapy that helps clients discover their purpose in the midst of unavoidable suffering. Viktor Frankl never had to wind up in a concentration camp because he was a renowned psychiatrist. So his parents told him to go to America to be a psychiatrist. Hitler is coming. And Viktor Frankl saw the Statue of Liberty and it brought tears to his eyes. He said there were people in Rikers Island in New York that were freer than people walking the streets where he lived because Hitler was bombing. And so he was hired in America. And he went back home to give his mother a hug. And he discovered that while he was gone, the synagogue that he attended was bombed by the Nazis. So he picked up a brick off the ground, the one that said, honor thy mother, one of the 10 commandments, honor thy mother and thy father. So he stayed near his parents and the Nazis captured him. His famous quote, you can take anything away from a person except for one thing, the freedom to choose how they will respond to whatever horrible circumstance they find themselves in. And what he discovered was that purpose has the ability to keep people alive. And Viktor Frankl talks about the 5 things that give life meaning. The attitude that one takes towards unavoidable suffering. You and I know people who suffered a loss, like mothers against drunk driving. Her daughter was killed by a drunk driver. There's a group called Mothers Against Gangs, started by a woman whose son was killed by a gang member, and she started supporting others, and they created purpose for her. Some of the people who are contributing greatly to addictions recovery are people who are well-to-do that have had sons or daughters who've overdosed off of drugs. So a question we ask our clients who are grieving, can you take your pain and turn it into a cause? Viktor Frankl says that few things give life meaning like meaningful work. I know that what kept me alive is I decided to go around the country giving people permission to grieve, repeating that quote that I heard in that seminar, that grief is not about forgetting, it's about remembering with less pain. I know when I didn't think I could do my work anymore, I looked in the appointment book and I had one more speech, and then one more speech, and then 3 days later, one more speech. And suddenly I realized that speaking was keeping me alive. Love gives life meaning, purpose. That's why when our clients suffer a loss, we want to make sure they're connected with people who care about them. Taking a stand gives life meaning, purpose. And of course, like you do, helping other people, even when we suffer a loss, gives life meaning and purpose. So we want for a moment to talk about ways in which average everyday people keep memories alive when they suffer a loss. We have some examples here. One way people keep memories alive, and I'll ask you to add to the list when they suffer a loss. You ever like drove on a highway and you see where people put up a cross and some flowers? That's one way they keep memories alive. Or you take George Floyd, they create a memorial right there in the spot where they died. What are some other ways that people keep memories alive when they suffer a loss? You can put your response in chat. Ed or Michelle, do you see any responses? So within those 50 books that I read on grief, I learned that there were rituals all over the world that people use to deal with loss. Like in Africa, they do what's called libations. Libations are also common in Kwanzaa celebrations, where you take something that's, say, pure like water, and you pour it in something that's living like a plant, and slow pours. Each time you pour, you might usher in the names of the ancestors as a symbolic way of bringing their spirit into sacred rituals. Some cultural groups have feasts, celebrations with food when they suffer a loss. And then, of course, there's Shiva. In Jewish culture, you know, Shiva differs from a repast. You know the repast? You go to a funeral, you eat, and everybody goes their separate way. In Judaism, with Shiva, loved ones show up for about a week. They bring groceries, they cook for the people who suffer the loss, they tell stories, they reminisce for a whole week. You have some support. In Judaism, they also have what's called a CADC prayer. For 11 months, they continue to pray for the deceased. In Japan, they have what's called the death store. In the death store, they take pictures of everything. And they might bring some pictures to the gravesite as a way of wishing a better life in the hereafter than the person lived on earth. So that person who died never owned a car, they might bring a picture of a brand new Lamborghini. Or if they never married, they might bring a picture of someone who they think might have been a great spouse for them as a way of wishing for them a better life in the hereafter. Once a year in Japan, they call what's called the Aban, where they take these boats made out of wax candles and they put them on the ocean and they call out the names of those who've died. In Latino Hispanic culture, especially amongst Mexicans, they have what's called the Day of the Dead. They're Native Americans who remember by celebrating what's called the Feast of the Dead. What else may be helpful besides talk therapy? Going into chat rooms. No matter what type of loss your clients have suffered, there's a chat room for that loss. Or journaling, or doing art, or being in nature. Well, how about listening to music as a way of coping with loss? I have a song I want to play for you, not the whole song, just a minute or two of this song. It's one of those go-to songs that lets you know that life will be a little better even after you suffered a loss. Alexa, would you play Tomorrow by Lou Rawls?
Tomorrow, live by Lou Rawls on Amazon Music.
The music, but many a person has found music to be very soothing for them when they suffer loss, or meditation, or yoga, et cetera, et cetera. There's no one way to grieve, and we believe that many of these tools can help our clients deal with grief. So I'm going to pause, and we have a few minutes. We want to find out, are there any questions? I think, Michelle, you said that some people submitted questions in advance. We'd like to hear the questions.
We do have one question. Given the physical distancing requirements and recommendations, what alternatives to hugs may be recommended for preparing to or saying goodbye?
To people we've lost, yeah. I think that sometimes if the person is coherent, I think that people have been using like Zoom to be able to see the person and say goodbye that way. Maybe hospitals might be able to set that up. Creating memorials for people, having your own separate service. Saturday, I'm leaving the house for the first time, going a distance, wearing a mask to pay homage to the first mentor I ever had in this field. And they're having a memorial service. He died early in the year. I feel that I owe him that, and I look forward to that. But just by creating memorials can help. Doing something in that person's name can help. Is there another question? Is that primarily the question?
Yes. Recently, the person asking the question had a woman at a residential facility who lost her life due to homicide overdosing on campus. Could you, kind of give a brief statement on how to help them deal with walking past the house?
In those situations, I think in those situations, the whole community needs to come together. So, you've heard the expression that you cannot help with a situation unless you're in control of yourself. So I always encourage the staff coming together and grieving the loss, right? Matter of fact, I just spent the hour before we were together, this one program that works with like people who are most likely to do shootings in Chicago. They had 3 clients that were shot and killed recently. And what we processed was who the person was, what were they like, what did you see in them, who were they leaving behind, and how do we want to memorialize them? So I recommend that you do things with staff around that. As a staff, then you go in there with the community of clients, especially if the clients are aware of this, and you process that. And then so processing, you want to make sure that before you end that process, that you find out what people like to share, and is there anything they need from the community? Because whenever you talk about loss, people become vulnerable to use. And then follow up with each individual client, if they're aware of this loss, and find out what they might need to be of support of themselves. Those would be my recommendations. So here's something.
Someone asking if they could get a copy of the goodbye letter to their drug of choice.
Yeah, didn't they see I was improvising? I was freestyle improvising. But of course, I'll send you what I said, and you can work with this. So that's a plan. So Michelle, I'll send it to you, and you can distribute. And if there's some questions that people have that I don't get to, or questions later, I'll respond to all of those questions. This whole grief piece, even though I'm a CADC, is what keeps me alive, is these types of discussions. Is there another question? Because I have one to the group. One of the things I learned is that it's less about anything I teach, but it's more about the action that you take. So what I want you to put in chat is the one action you're going to take when you leave here as a result of the time that we spent in our webinar. What's the action you're going to take? You can put your answer in chat. And by chatting it, you'll see it, and you're more likely to do it. What's the action?
We have someone saying they're going with their training with the
Yeah, we can't hear you that well, Michelle. It's breaking up.
I
can hear you now.
They said they would definitely use your training and be more aware of the behaviors that may come off, and just be able to offer assurance that the grief is natural and not disorder.
I give them another observation. You ever notice that sometimes when clients go to residential treatment, they're arguing with each other about a sandwich, small things, what channel the TV is on? Many of them are missing the drug of choice. And so as Kubler-Ross said, that anger is one of those stages of grief. That's an opportunity to process grief there as well. Any other comments? What I have for you then, first is how you can reach me. And know that I really do have AOL. I really do have abandonment issues. You can ask me questions about grief. You can ask me questions around addiction. And if I don't know it, I got smart friends like Ed Johnson. We can figure this thing out. And of course, I have a website there. All right, so here's the story. You remember Monk, the sitcom Monk? Monk is living proof that you can have a lot of problems and still be successful. He's the world's greatest private eye. Monk has obsessive compulsive disorder, a fear of heights, a fear of germs, a fear of dark rooms. He's so nervous, he fears everything. I watched 2 episodes of Monk. The first episode I watched, Monk was on a plane. He hadn't flown since he was 9 years old. He's sitting next to a salesman and Monk was trembling in the air. The salesman thought that Monk was so strange. When the plane landed, he demanded that Monk give him back his business card. But luckily, Monk has the world's greatest assistant. All of us would be better at our job if we had an assistant like Monk's assistant. The world thinks that Monk is strange. She understands Monk. Second episode I watched. Monk's brother called. She answered, said, Monk, you never told me you had a brother. Hang up. I haven't seen my brother in 7 years. I haven't talked to my brother in 7 years. Hang up, my brother will stop calling. And 3 weeks went by and the brother never stopped calling. Finally, she answered again. The brother said, there's an emergency. I need to see my brother Monk right away. And so she dragged Monk over. And as soon as she met Monk's brother, she felt like she understood Monk better. The brother had a psychiatric condition called agoraphobia, the fear of the marketplace. He hadn't been outside in 7 years. No wonder Monk hadn't seen his brother. The door was open. She grabbed the brother's hand and she was leading him outside for the first time in 7 years. He was going to see daylight. And he took 2 steps back and he said, I can't go out there. And she whispered, you don't know this, but your brother Monk, he's scared all the time too. What does he have that you don't? And the brother looked at her and said, he has you and I don't. He has you. What separates the clients that you work with, some of you work with clients directly and others of you work with clients indirectly, is the fact that the client has you. And that's a good thing. So there's my information. And thank you so very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you to Southeast ATTC for sponsoring our webinar. I think that there's some announcements. So hold on.
All right.